GingerGM.
Well, hi everyone, and welcome to my roundup of the semi-finals, the first leg of the semi-finals at the Goldmoney Champions Tour. We've been following it most days, and there's only 4 players left. So let's first of all just have a look at what's happening so far. So, reaching the semi-finals, we have 2 legends of the game, Lev Aronian and, of course, the world champion, who's celebrating his 10 years today of being the highest rated player in the world, Magnus Carlsen. In the other semi-final, Liren, China's top player, versus Vladislav Artimiev, who's been incredibly impressive. And let's just remind you that there are 2 days of this. So this is the first day. And then tomorrow is the final day, and that will decide who goes through. So if either side wins today, that gives them a good bonus going in tomorrow. They only need to draw out of the 4 games tomorrow. So we're going to have a look at both pairings, and we're going to start with Aronian versus Magnus Carlsen. And these 2 guys have played each other so many times, and I'm just going to bring you highlights of the games today. We're going to keep this very short, very sweet, and the theme of the day really, and one of the reasons that Magnus Carlsen is the best player in the world, has been the highest rated player in the world for 10 years, is his incredible endgame play. There's, in my opinion, never been an endgame player like him, and he time and time again wins against the other elite players in the ending from often drawn positions. So, I mean, something that's pretty unheard of. But in the first game, and let's remember there's 4 games today, it was Aronian who struck first. We have the following position where we have this quite strange pawn formation with white having these 2 central pawns, which can be very good, but black having counterplay on the queen side with his 3 pawns. Now, a critical moment came about after Lev now played the move b4. Now, what would you play here after this move? Lev with the white pieces, Magnus with black. Magnus captured on b4, and in some ways I think this is the losing move. After this capture, yes, black has 2 connected passed pawns, but they're never gonna threaten white. They're blockaded on the dart squares, they can't really move, and if anything, they're more of targets to white's pieces. White can put pressure on them by bringing his pieces around. And we'll just have a look at how the game went. Magnus tried to get an open file, and now rook a2, just stopping the black rook coming in. Rook c7, and now rook a1. A little bit of dancing about here. There's probably more critical moves, but it doesn't matter so much at the moment. Bishop c8, and now Lev finds the right plan. He removes the queens from the board. Why is this a good plan? Black's queen can be a little bit annoying here, and the queen does a good job of defending black's pawns. So after the exchange of queens, these pawns are a little bit more weakened, and the pawn on d5 is a real strong Trojan. It supports a knight coming in, and it's very far advanced. Bishop d7 to stop that knight coming in, and now just f3. This pawn chain exceptionally good, and what a lot of strong players do, they don't rush into capturing the first pawn available. They wait until a better opportunity. a5, trying to cause a little bit of trouble over there, but even now Lev doesn't capture it. He lines up, threatening both pawns. a4, and here knight takes b5. The pawn gets removed. Rook c2, and the knight just goes to a very safe square where it has chances to bounce out. Rook a8, and that pawn is now blockaded. And of course, this pawn may look a bit dangerous, but with the knight here, it's really just a simple pawn up in the center. Black's pieces have to remain in front of those pawns, and Lev ground this one down very nicely. First of all, he exchanges off some pieces, being a pawn up, a wise thing to do. He now uses and gets his pieces that are not playing a part into the game. The knight gradually moves its way around to a very nice square. The rook comes here to stop it coming to d4, but now the other knight can come in, threatening knight to e5. The knight still goes to e5, and now knight to c3 hits the bishop, and after knight d6, well, the game is really over at this point. where Lev's 2 pawns up. So Lev takes a 1-point lead. Another reason Magnus is the world champion is his bounce back ability. No one in chess, maybe in the history of chess, can bounce back as well as Magnus Carlsen. And we now go into the next game. They had a draw after that. Remember, it's 4 games and Lev is 1 game up with 2 to go. So Magnus needs to win both of these games to win the first leg. And we go into the start of an endgame position where after king to e4, Magnus is certainly a little bit better here. Why is he better? In the ending, and this is one key thing we're going to see in the examples I'm going to show you, king activity is just so important. King activity is really a deciding factor along with the rook activity, and you've got to keep your rook active. And here the white rook is very active and the king is active. Lev now plays a very clever move. He goes h5. Had he tried to defend passively, well, we'll see what happens. This is a way to at least get the rook into the game. Brilliant move. After h3, we get this position here. And again, I think a lot of weaker players would have played a passive move like rook b8 here, trying to hold on to that pawn, defending passively. And this is something we can all learn from rook ending. So far, Lev doesn't play this move and plays very well. Rook activity is more important than 1 pawn. And I think after white breaks with d5, and now he can either capture, when again the king and the rook have great potential, he can also come into f5 and cause lots of problems this way. I think this is losing for black, both of these lines. Let's go back to the game. Lev plays rook h8. The rook is aiming to get around the back. Magnus plays d5. And after captures, king f5. Again, this may look very strange because he could have captured a pawn, but this is much more troublesome for Lev. It gives him a lot of things to think about. Magnus can now either take that pawn, go for the d pawn, or aim to play rook c7 and e6. How should Lev draw this? Well, his next move, rook to h2, is not a bad move because it activates the rook. But a more accurate move here would have been first b5. The idea of this is to really play b4. When you're trying to defend a rook ending, you want to swap off as many pawns as you can. Yes, you're probably going to lose a lot of these pawns, but try to get rid of one of the white pawns here. So after a move like rook c5, well, you can go b4, but now play d4. Use this pawn as a distractor for the rook. And after continuation, like rook d5, now rook h2. Rook takes b5 and use this pawn. And after something like rook d5, d2, I expect this will be a draw because the pawn caused a lot of problems. So let's go back to this position. b5, a good move. What if Magnus had tried rook c7, trying to go e6? Well, yet again, it's the activity of the rook. And rook h2 is the correct way. If e6 is played, we can play rook f2 check. And after king takes g5, now the king is cut off. We use the d pawn as a distractor. This will take the white rook away from its active role. We better swap off pawns and gain a draw. Of course, this position looks very risky, but there's no obvious way white can play. If he ever pushes the pawn, we now get our rook behind the pawn, and we will win that pawn by using our d pawn. If white plays rook d7, which is going to have to play at some point, we can now even play a4, just cementing these 2 pawns, making sure they can't move. And after this one, take on b2. And lots of pawns are getting exchanged. It's likely to become a draw. Now, the way the game went, rook h2 is played, but after rook takes b6 and rook takes g5, we get similar positions, but Magnus has this extra pawn. Lev has not been able to swap it off. And the final nail in the coffin, Lev now plays the right idea. There's very fine lines between drawing these and losing. Magnus plays very well, getting this pawn up. And here, he's got a nice rook defending everything, but he's got a winning plan. And the winning plan is to swap the e pawn for the f pawn, when the g pawn will be a very strong passed pawn. That g pawn will tie the black king down to it. And even then, the white king can come over and try to take black's a pawn. And if you can picture that position, black's king will be so far from the action, it won't be able to stop the a pawn combined with the king and the rook. So rook b4 tried, rook f4, king f8, and we see Magnus now play this plan. He plays e6. And here Lev Hatchett tried taking it, but he blunders here with king e7. Can you see the winning idea here? A winning idea that wins another pawn and makes the rest of the game relatively simple. You could take on f7. This has to be captured. And now king g5 check. The king has to move, and the key move, rook f5. This pawn will drop, and after that pawn drops, well, it's very, very simple. Let's just go through the moves very quickly. See how Magnus won. He uses his pawns slowly, advances them as much as he can, and again he can advance them another file, so he does, and you can see the process here. And now the king is used. Now he's got his pawns as far as he can. This is the winning plan we talked about, the king coming over here, supporting this pawn, and around here the king is just going to simply come to b6. It can hide on c7, and then the rook can come to b6, the king there, and we queen it. Very easy. So this leveled the match, and well, again, let's just have a look at the standings so far in this exciting match. The standings before, well, you see they play 4 games there, and at the moment it all came down to the last game in the Aronian Magnus game. Would it be a draw? It looked like it was going to be a draw for a very long time. We're picking up again in another rook ending. Just want to stick to rook endings in this match because they were the key points. Keep it a bit sharper and quicker. Now here, Magnus is a pawn up, but black has this pawn again. Lev has the distracting pawn. His king is also quite active, and his rook is holding that pawn down. Magnus gets behind the pawn. Lev pushes the king up, and now Lev is able to level the playing field. Lev leveling. The king tries to come across, and now what is the key drawing move here? And again, these little moves, they are so important. And can you see the idea? You can see white's plan is simply to bring the king, take this pawn. Black has no time to take the h6 pawn, because like that last ending, his king will be on totally the wrong side of the board, allowing white's king to come through and munch all these. Let's just show that. King here. If you go into the rook and pawn ending, well, the king and pawn ending, should I say, the black king is far too slow, and the white king goes munchy in this position. So anyone got an idea what the drawing move is? Lev plays the brilliant rook d8. You have to stop the white king entering the game. Magnus tries to exchange rooks with rook d1, but Lev's not falling for that. He puts the rook on d3. And now the king and pawn ending would be totally different, because this pawn here would actually lead to a black win. Magnus goes back to h1. Another thing I've noticed Magnus does in these endings, because he's supremely confident, is, and with right reasons, he just keeps trying everything. If he tries one idea, like he's tried here, he might realise it won't get anywhere. He'll go back and it'll start again. He will keep being persistent, like a little, a little mosquito trying to get you. And at some point, it will get through and sting you. Lev keeps it sensible. Rook d8. We have this position already. h7. This forces king g7. You've got to keep the rook here. Rook h5. And this is Magnus's last try, trying to now aim for those pawns. What is the drawing move now? There's only, I think, one way to draw, but it's a very good way to draw. Well, it's surprising. It's like the last game. You need to, or Lev needed to use the e pawn as a distractor. Had he now played e3, we get the same principle as before. White will have to take this pawn with his rook, and that means black can eliminate this pawn. And this is the dangerous pawn on h7, because once that pawn is eliminated, the black king can come back and look after its pawns. So, for example, rook to h2. What else can you play? Well, if you go rook takes b5, just king takes h7. And after rook e5, you have to get behind that pawn at some point. Rook d3 is the key move. The white king is in a box. It can't escape anywhere. That piece can't play a part in the game. And the issue is you can never take on c4. So white can't make any progress. If anyone can win this, it's actually black. Black might be able to bring his king up. For example, rook e4, king g6. The king is coming. You can't take this one because of e2 and rook d1 and e1, and black will win. So clearly taking the pawn in that last line is not possible. What if he tries to play instead, after the move e3, what if he tries to play rook h2, holding the pawn, just waits? Well, black can just go king h8, king g7 for the rest of the time. King h8, because again, the white king can't play a part. If the white rook ever moves, we take that pawn, and this should be an easy draw. Let's defend that file, defend the pawn first, and of course it's an easy draw. Magnus's reaction after rook e8, and this was a terrible move from Lev, was quite shocking. Lev just not on top form here, and this is a really important loss because this lost the first day's activities, meaning tomorrow Lev has to win over the 4 games to take it to playoff. Magnus, therefore, big favourite to go into the final. And this allowed the white king into the game. The difference now is, well, white can certainly take that pawn because his king is dealing with Lev's passed pawn. He does take the pawn, and now he can simply start mopping up these other pawns, and it's easy to see here with these pawns going and the black king being so far away from the action, it was a win. And Magnus Carlsen therefore is not in the final yet, but he's won the first leg. All he needs to do is draw tomorrow. Now I'm just going to show you one game from Ding's battle, and Ding was really playing extremely well today. One thing you've got to remember about Ding, in 2019, only over 2 years ago, he was world number 2 by quite some way before the candidates, and everyone was saying this guy Ding, he's going to win the candidates, he's going to be a real tough challenger for Magnus Carlsen, he might be world champion. He was everyone's tip, and I think he was very unfortunate. COVID came along, and I think it affected him and some of the Chinese players more. Their ability to travel seemed harder, their ability to work, and other factors. It really didn't help them. He had a very bad candidates, and he hasn't been playing particularly well since then, but he's really bounced back, and he's a very dangerous player. Now let's flip the board and see it from his point of view. A very complex position, all the pieces on the board, but now he starts a very good plan. He's got a majority on the king side, but he needs to use that majority. What is white's problem? White is lacking a pawn in front of his king to protect his king. So after queen e8 and now g5, black starts this attack, which is a fantastic way to play. And in this position, he gets 2 mobile pawns supported by all of his pieces, and this is a very good attacking position. Artimiev should have smelt the danger here. He played knight to f3, which just helped black as black's queen came in. He had an opportunity to play knight d6. Had he played this move now, it's unclear. And this is like having that sense of danger which the great players have, something which Artimiev, I'm sure, will learn. It's knowing when you've got to do something drastic, even give up a pawn, just to open lines, to stop your opponent just doing his very easy moves that will improve his position. This does create some chaos. We're going to take that pawn, we're a tempo up on what the game is. If the knight is taken, well, you've opened up lines here, and rook takes d6 and now even be a mistake because of knight c4, and all of a sudden white's pieces fly in. If you take that one, the queen comes in with check, takes on c5, and now black hasn't got these bishops as he has in the game. His king side could even be a little bit weak. So knight to f3 was played, and now queen g6, he plays knight d6, but it's just a little bit late. In actual fact, after g4, white's knight has just lost tempo, and with f4 coming, you can see just how deadly these pawns are. The bishop comes in, the queen simply retreats. White has to grab a pawn. In a bad position, you might as well take as much material as you can. The knight's on pre. The knight comes over towards the king. There's no reason to defend your pieces here because you have everything looming for the final attack. Knight d3, and now knight to f3 check. A very clever move. This can't be taken because of check, and we win the queen. The king goes to g2. Now, what would have happened if this move was played? Can anyone see a great move in this position? king g2 was actually the only move. This doesn't work. Knight g3 check, a beautiful move. You have to take this one because of the queen, and now our queen enters into h2 with mate. This is a very famous pattern, the knight and queen just gelling extremely well together. So the king had to go to g2, and here maybe the only mistake of the game or the day for Ding, who was so impressive. He plays knight to h4, just repeating, trying to see what happened, not repeating the position, but in actual fact there was a much easier win here. All you've got to think here is if that knight's not on the board, black wins immediately with f3. So what should you play? Quite hard to see, but knight d4. This move gains the tempo by attacking the queen, and of course it can't be captured because f3 check. If we win the queen, we win the game, and we're going to win the queen because this one is check as well. So knight to h4 check came, and now white plays a mistake. He goes king g1. This is the last mistake of the game. In this position, he should have tried king to h1. Of course, this is dangerous because those ideas of g3, but it's a better try. You have to get off this g file. I think black would play something like queen h6, lining up this move again, but white has a surprising defensive move, rook a2, coming across to defend, and this stops the idea of this check because we can capture, and if knight f3 check, and this is obviously very, very tough to see, white has this move, and he can actually, funnily enough, fight on with this very shocking defensive move. Knight takes, rook takes. Yes, black is a queen up, but white has a rook and a knight, and he's also going to win on f4 and maybe start getting his own counter-attack here. It was the best chance anyway. After king g1, f3, here it comes. Bishop h7 was a desperate try to get the white queen in. g3, just relentless stuff here from Ding. Queen e4 check, rook f5, not even going, just going forwards. Now Artimiev finds the right idea, but it's just too late. Double check. The queen wants to come into g2, so you have to get rid of that pawn. Every piece plays a part. The bishop comes in, and there's no way you can survive this position as white with so many pieces attacking. The king simply can't move because it will be the end. If it goes to h1, then our knight comes in. So knight to f4 was forced, and now just knight takes f4. White does his best to defend, but after queen g3, this cloud of darkness is around the king. White tries to check the king, but after king h5, there's not really any good checks. Knight e8 the only try. A very amusing idea would be to bring it all the way to h3, but knight g6 is very nice because you cover all the squares the white queen can try to check the king on, and the big threat in this position is just queen h3 and rook g5. Rook f2 played, and the idea of this, if you go check, well, there is now rook h2. Funnily enough, this position probably is even losing for white because we can take that one and take there and then play here, but it's not entirely clear. Should be winning after the queen gets there. Ding finds another tremendous move. This is where Ding is the best in the world, in sharp positions like this. Him and Nepo and some of the other players. He realizes his rook wants to get to h5, and he now very craftily steps back. Look how the knight just stops any chance the white queen can get a check in. The idea is now simply rook to h5, which will be the end of the game. So white has to try rook h2, and now rook h5 anyway. As soon as we get rid of the rooks, white's king can't be defended. Rook takes, king takes, there's no checks. White tries to stop the queen coming there, but now another little dinky move here, just moving the king, showing domination, saying what are you going to play? You have no moves. The queen goes to e4, f2, this is threatened, queen g2, queen h4, and white resigns. So the first day, Ding was very impressive. He won by a big score. I think it was 3.5 half, Magnus 2.5, 1.5. meaning Vladislav's got to bounce back tomorrow. It's going to be very tough, and so does Aronian. At the moment, a Liren versus Magnus Carlsen final is looking extremely likely. Can't wait to see that. Remember to like and subscribe to my channel, please do, and I'll be back with the second leg tomorrow and, of course, the final highlights.